Welcome to the Principled Podcast, brought to you by LRN. The Principled Podcast brings together the collective wisdom on ethics, business and compliance, transformative stories of leadership, and inspiring workplace culture. Listen in to discover valuable strategies from our community of business leaders and workplace changemakers.
LRN's most recent Ethics and Compliance Program Effectiveness Report found an increasing disconnect between leadership and middle management when it comes to embedding ethics and compliance values into decision-making. This leadership gap was further emphasized by LRN's Benchmark of Ethical Culture study that highlighted the divide in the experience of senior leaders, middle management, and individual contributors. Specifically, executives and senior leaders are 2.6 times more likely to indicate their organization has a strong ethical culture than individual contributors and frontline employees. But as regulatory risks continue to grow and evolve, how can organizations work to close this crucial gap and empower leaders to truly lead on ethics and compliance issues? Hello, and welcome to another episode of LRN's Principled Podcast. I'm your host, Amy Hanan, Chief Marketing Officer here at LRN. And today I'm joined by Virgin Media O2's Head of Compliance, Lance King. Lance has over 25 years of financial services leadership experience, which has included P&L responsibility in frontline retail banking and media stores teams, and now leads the compliance function in one of the largest media companies in the UK. Given both his frontline and compliance function leadership experience, Lance has unique insight into the key considerations in building high-performing compliance teams, regulatory risk themes, and forward-looking priorities, and how to develop effective relationships from the shop floor to the C-suite. Lance, thanks so much for coming on the Principled Podcast today.
It's great to be with you, Amy. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise. So let's just get started with the first topic here. You have a really interesting career journey. I mentioned just a couple of aspects of it in the introduction here, but the journey from leading P&L responsibility at bank branches with sales teams to leading the compliance program of one of the UK's largest telco companies. So, in your opinion, what are some key considerations in leading high-performing teams?
Yeah, as you say, Amy, I've had a not unique but interesting career trajectory from leading branches, but also leading stores, and then moving into the compliance profession a decade ago. And actually, there's some really interesting read across from leading retail teams and leading compliance teams as well. I think from a retail perspective, there's real kind of tangible outputs in terms of the quality of leadership in regards to key performance indicators. So you're held to account in terms of your customer growth figures, your customer service, your compliance scores. And often what you see over those teams that perform over a longer period, it's really based upon a principle that some of our listeners may be familiar with in terms of the service profit share. And this is something that is emanated out of the US and was based upon the Southwest Airlines model in the 90s, which essentially is based upon, if you have super engaged employees, they will deliver fantastic client experience. And if you deliver a fantastic client experience, that differentiates you in terms of the high street. And I think you can take those principles from a compliance perspective as well in terms of leading teams. And I suppose there's three key things I kind of focus upon when leading compliance teams. The first one is ensuring that there is an alignment between the team purpose and what the colleague purpose is. So when you join a compliance team, why are you here? Why have you joined this organization? Why is it relevant for you? And what do you want to use that tenure and that compliance function to achieve? The second thing is around hiring colleagues and growing for the maturity phase that you are in. So essentially, when I was building teams at the beginning of our journey, very much focused upon the skill set that I needed for the initial phase, but also the skill set I needed for the 2 or 3 periods that we're about to embark. And then the final thing for me in terms of key leadership principles is the diversity and inclusivity in terms of your team. And I don't just mean from a gender and ethnicity or orientation, I mean from an experience perspective as well. So what I try and do is cram my teams full of ex-regulators, ex-compliance professionals that worked in other organisations, ex-auditors, ex-frontline staff. Because what you do if you get that mix sat around the table, it really provides an effective challenge in terms of risk identification and making sure that our controls are proportionate to the risk that is live in the front line.
Mm-hmm. And we often hear that compliance officers have needs for greater investment in their compliance resources, right? To be able to more effectively respond to then also the increased regulator demands, the new legislation that's always coming out. And in fact, this was something that we had started discussing, the two of us, when we met at a roundtable event a couple of months ago. So I think it'd be great if you could share with our audience listening now some of your views on the best way to ensure compliance functions have adequate resources so that they are discharging their responsibilities efficiently and effectively.
Absolutely. And I think my principles from this also come from, and I didn't realize this following our conversation, I was reflecting, also come from a retail background as well. So when you're responsible for bank branches or stores, essentially the business will provide a level of resource for you to deploy. So if I'm looking after a region of 50 branches, I will be given a full-time equivalent resource to effectively man those or resource those branches over a 6 or 7 day period. And you have to make decisions in terms of deploying the right resource in the right place. And when reflecting on what that principle means from a compliance function perspective, I very much talk to my senior compliance leads on the basis of what I call the 1,000-hour principle. So that is essentially the organisation provides you with a finite amount of resource. In terms of this example, let's say 1,000 hours to deliver your core functions, whether that's monitoring, advisory, training, regulatory change, that defined level of resource. And so essentially when you're going through kind of periods where you need to assess resource deployment, every hour you spend has an alternative that you could spend that hour. So that the opportunity cost kind of principle. So whenever I'm faced in terms of a situation where, whether it's internal resource demands or external resource demands, there are essentially three ways that I respond to. The first way is around dialing up or dialing down controls. So in light of increased risk, improving and putting more controls in place. But equally, when risk has been effectively mitigated over a period, there's an opportunity to move out the frequency or dial down those controls. The second piece is about automation. So how can we as a compliance function improve data analytics or processing of data so we can use that really precious human resource for the analysis and the business engagement? But the third thing is around recontracting. And what I mean by that is that if you're about to embark on a significant piece of legislative change that needs to be led within the business, either looking at can you repivot and redeploy some of the requirements that the second line have taken on to the first line of defence, or secondly, recontracting in with the executive team and saying, I need an additional 100 hours here. So in order to deliver this piece of regulatory change over the next 3 months, and having that kind of honest and candid conversation around contracting in, around clarity of scope, the compliance function will protect the business.
And I thought that 1,000-hour principle was so powerful when you first shared it with me and applicable to almost any business team or function, but particularly useful for those that are constantly assessing priorities and constantly having to, as you described, dial up or dial down certain core activities. And so I kind of want to pivot the discussion just a little bit so we can get some of your views on what some of those regulatory priorities might be looking like. And you've already touched on some of your financial services experience, but we know that financial services as an industry is particularly impacted by regulatory issues and legislation. Could you share from your experience what are some of the compliance related challenges that you think the financial services industry faces now most acutely or likely to face in the near term future?
Yeah, so I think in answering this question, there are very much kind of two protection pillars that we will look at. First is around customer protection, which is there's a very heavy focus here within the EU, but also following lockdown and the COVID, we've also seen in the UK a step change in the level of financial crime and fraud, and both of those two areas are very heavily on the regulators' agenda. And there's some themes in terms of regulatory evolution as well, which are applicable to both of those areas. From a customer protection basis here in the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority, which regulates the financial services sector, has introduced new rules and guidance in relation to consumer duty. For those that aren't familiar with it, that's essentially the FCA is a principles and outcomes regulator. And what the consumer duty does is provide more clarity around expected outcomes that companies need to consider in part of their offerings to consumers. That's looking across products and services, price and value. So do your propositions have a societal value, customer support, and also customer understanding as well. And I think one of the areas of particular interest at the moment is around access to customer support. The FCA referencing what was sludge practices. So if a client can contact your organisation and speak to a sales team within 90 seconds, yet it takes them 20 minutes to get through for forbearance, have you got that right in terms of balancing of the service that you provide? And then financial crime, very much we are currently in the middle of the UK government 3-year plan to reduce financial crime. And essentially what that is looking at is around tightening around sanctions evasion, continued focus on money laundering, particularly cash transactions, and really looking at, I'm sure we'll get onto this in a few moments, about financial crime prevention and ensuring that the marketplace is really working together as an ecosystem to reduce financial crime. But the piece I want to kind of emphasize is that the regulator is evolving. And here in the UK, the FCA talks about the data-driven regulator being more proactive and being more preventative. And I think when we look historically at the crisis from the financial sector during the 90s and the 2000s, the regulator has often been criticised of responding to crises rather than preventing crises. So what the FCA is beginning to do to look at is using its data analytics to really try and identify what is the next thing that is likely to hit and deal with it before it hits and causes bad kind of customer outcomes. And what we've also seen as well is the deployment of data analytics and the regulators using multiple sources. And that comes with a risk as regulated entities, because there's always a danger that if the regulator is deploying sophisticated data analytics, it identifies concerns in regards to the operation of your firm that is a blind spot you haven't identified yourself. So key from a compliance officer consideration moving forward is that deployment of data analytics to make sure you remain aligned, close that regulatory gap with regards to progressive regulator really upping its game with.
I think we can pick up on some of the points you were making there around economic crime and maybe even some of the data and analytics, right, that are really required here. Because in the past year, we know that the UK Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act went into effect, right, creating a list of procedures that organizations must follow in order to comply with failure to prevent fraud requirements, including adopting organization cultures that understand the importance of fraud risk and prevention. So, how can companies approach this challenge to make sure that they are fostering transparent, honest, responsible organizations with a look to prevent economic crime and fraud?
This is a really timely area of discussion, this particular point. And as you rightly said, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act came into effect in November of last year. And the purpose of that act was to improve fraud prevention procedures, strengthen regulatory powers and close previous loops, really place corporate liability for failing to prevent fraud where the organisation benefits from fraud. And the framework very much follows the similar sort of procedures in terms of the UK Bribery Act, proportionate procedure guidance in terms of tone from the top, risk assessment, proportionate procedures, and so forth. We are currently waiting, as part of the Act, the UK Home Office is required to publish guidance, and that guidance is imminent. So I know from across speaking to my industry peers, compliance officers at the moment are considering a number of options in readiness for that guidance. And I think from a guidance perspective, three key things. Firstly, you need to have already started or certainly have on the roadmap that senior management engagement, and particularly seek out exec sponsorship from what is going to be an imminent project. And what we are beginning to see in the sector is, whilst there is no designated home for this, we are seeing in a majority of cases that compliance officers and their teams are beginning to hold the pen in terms of readiness activity. I think the second piece is around risk discovery or risk identification. So very much the Act is for corporates to be held liable for those that act upon their behalf. So that identification of who is it that are making decisions on behalf of your organisation that could find that organisation could problem from a fraud prevention series. And then when you're going through the risk identification process, it's really important to look at it from a holistic point of view rather than silos. Get those kind of key risk owners, your HR professionals, your audit professionals, your P&L owners, all in the room and talk about where the fraud risks are prevalent. And what you find when you do that exercise is it really develops rich conversation and people build upon themes that each other's kind of identify. And also looking at really rich sources of data within the organisation. So where have there been fraud investigations previously? Looking at kind of disciplinary and speak up trends will give you a real good indication as to maybe some of the inherent risks that the organisation faces. And then once those risks have been identified, that will then drive a gap analysis process. And let's not forget, the failure to prevent fraud does not happen in isolation. There are already organisational procedures in place for tax evasion, for bribery. So, for example, you'll already have training in place. You'll already have speak-up processes in place. But you just need to test the thinking that rather than applying those through a bribery lens or a tax evasion lens, do they stand up and would they protect business from a fraud prevention? And I think the final thing I would like to contribute in terms of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act is, for my mind, you're looking at it very much as a pie chart in terms of the engagement with senior management. It's about fraud prevention, and you'll have two parts of that pie chart. Fraud prevention where the organisation is the victim, and fraud prevention where the organisation is the beneficiary. And for me, it's around, there will be overlap in terms of control frameworks, but it's bringing those together, talking about fraud prevention, but making sure you address the inherent risks that are within those two subgroups.
I think within every discussion topic so far, you have highlighted executive sponsorship, partnership across various functions, within the organization, within this compliance framework we've been chatting about. So I'd like to dig in a little bit more on some of those issues because, as I said in the opening here, broadly research has shown, but also LRO's own proprietary research has shown that C-suite executives are often disconnected when it comes to compliance responsibilities and strategy, compliance as a leadership task, while at the same time they say with assurance that proper controls are in place. Many C-suite leaders have not actively participated in compliance awareness, education, or truly have integrated compliance as a core set of their leadership responsibilities. So I'm curious if you could offer any insight into perhaps why that might be the case, or just generally what your view on the responsibility that C-suite leaders should or maybe should not take when it comes to ethics and compliance.
Like a true politician, I'm going to flip your answer a little bit. And in answering that, I'll talk through a lens from what I think compliance officers should do to influence C-suite engagement. Look at ourselves in the mirror first around where maybe we can be more effective. I think we've been helped in the UK here. Senior management accountability has been a continued theme over the last 5 years. So if you look at the UK Bribery Act and the Ministry of Justice guidance, talking about the importance of tone from the top. We have the FCA senior managers regime, which also talks about senior managers taking reasonable steps in terms of their areas of responsibility. And look, we've also just talked about the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, and tone from the top in terms of the Home Office guidance also touches upon that as well. So the legal and the regulatory framework is helping us. I think from a C-suite engagement perspective, it's interesting to look at the dynamic of the C-suite as a collective, but also the C-suite as individual personal motivators as well. So to catch the attention of the C-suite, it's normally based on one of four things. Either fear for themselves, so what are the consequences if I get it wrong, right? And what we see in the accountability regime within the UK is unlimited fines, direct disbarment, and in the case of UK bribery, imprisonment for up to 10 years, right? So is the motivation one of fear of what that means for me as an individual? Is the motivation based upon fear of what that means for us as a corporate entity in terms of the brand implications and the inconvenience that comes with walking through a regulatory issue? Is the organisation one that's committed to using compliance as a competitive edge or an endorsement from an ethics perspective? And what you normally find is the C-suite will have a dominant motivating factor as a group, but also as individual entities and as compliance professionals. I think it's always worth reflecting and considering what is it that your C-suite is concerned about, and ensuring that you reference that in terms of your communication and ongoing engagement. I think from an individual perspective, if we look from the implications from a personal perspective, I think that should be a continual thing, whether it's through internal or external audit activity of your framework, or when you revisit the annual risk assessment process. And one of the things I talk about to my team is the principle of project pre-mortem. And project pre-mortem is very much you put yourself into the future, 5 years into the future, and you go, let's go role play. We are in a situation where we are having to face regulatory scrutiny in a particular matter. Does our framework stand up? Can we evidence appropriate tone from the top? So don't wait for the issue to arrive to have those conversations. If you think there is a gap in terms of C-suite engagement, so address that through your audit activity, address it through your annual risk assessment, and then address it through your continual engagement using those motivating factors. So, that pre-mortem future test, if we had an issue, And you can look at whether it's the Department of Justice guidance in the US or the Serious Fraud Office guidance in the UK, very prescriptive in what they will look in terms of tone from the top engagement. Are your C-suite aligned to that, or is improvement required?
Mm-hmm. The flip side of the tone from the top engagement could be said to be the then C-suite perception of the organizational culture. And we saw in our own study earlier this year with the Benchmark of Ethical Culture report that continues to be a disconnect between senior executives and middle management on the perception of organizational ethical culture, right? And that executives experiencing overall the culture to be more ethical, more values-based than the way middle management is perceiving it. Given your experience, what do you think are some key considerations for effective collaboration and working relationships between compliance and middle management in particular, right? We find this middle management layer to be struggling with both the perception of ethical culture in the organization and then also in, at least around self-reporting, their ability to apply company values to difficult decisions.
Yeah, and as I say, in terms of my career progression, I've been fortunate to work in middle management roles, being a P&L owner, and also in this role, engaging middle management from the other side of the compliance fence and with the C-suite. And I think middle management are absolutely critical because it is at that point in the organisation. We have a phrase maybe familiar where the rubber hits the road, right? So the central executive team will paint the vision, paint the priorities, but where that then leads into operational behaviour, that sits with middle management. And we've talked previously about ethics and compliance, with ethics is the cultural point, doing the right thing. Compliance being the checking that the right thing has been done, right? So it's important from a culture and a control perspective. And I think in answering your question, I will talk about firstly the approach to engaging middle, and then secondly ways of working with middle. So for me, the approach of working with middle management is very much create compliance as a business partner approach. We share the same objectives, which is the long-term sustainability and success of this organisation. And we are there to be used as a point of expertise to help guide and support the business. So very much serving the business, being a business to middle management. That is absolutely underpinned by trust and understanding and clarity on what the role of compliance is and what the role of management is in terms of risk identification and risk mitigation. And then thirdly, the ability to flex what those roles look like as to where you are at in terms of your compliance maturity journey. So a relatively inexperienced compliance maturity will need greater compliance advisory support and really working close together. Once you've developed that skills, knowledge, and competence in the first line, you can then begin to move away and do a more pure monitoring role. So consider what your knowledge, skills, and experience, and make sure that compliance is relevant to the middle management, but supporting in risk mitigation from an organisation perspective. And then in terms of ways of working, what I will talk about is kind of underpinning ethoses. Is firstly, if you're working with the front line of the business, right, it is when you're building controls or when you're dealing with regulatory change, build together. So what is the risk? What does the control look like? And work together in building that control. And what you often find is that where compliance and frontline work together, the control in building control, those controls are effective because the frontline will understand the purpose that control has been developed for. Where in my long career, I've seen controls that are maybe less effective. That's often where the controls are built and designed in the centre and imposed upon business with lack of consultation. And then essentially the risk there is you get control for control's sake rather than control for risk mitigation. The second piece is around proportionality and ensuring that you don't over-index. We are there to support the business in delivering great customer outcomes. So make sure your risk mitigation policies and procedures and training is proportionate to that. And then the third thing is around creating listening posts within the business, because that's where you're going to find where the real risks lie within your organization. And I have a slight unique approach in terms of dealing with this. I always think about when the business comes to you with an issue, celebrate issue identification. All right? Say thank you. Well done. You spotted it. Let's work together. If I had £1 for every time a frontline colleague said to me, I wasn't looking forward to sharing that bad news with you, and that was easier than what I thought it was going to be. For me, that's a true test in terms of compliance approachability. And the most important bit of that approachability, right, is that if you deal with that issue at escalation, right, and in a supportive manner, they're more likely to come and tell you the next bigger thing. And there's nothing, the risk of a compliance function that is removed from the business is that shadows exist. So if you create that business partner approach, you work in building together, and that approachability and celebrating issue identification, which sounds kind of counterproductive, right? What it does is it removes, but you have less shadows within the organization where undetected risks can be prevalent.
I feel like you've offered so much in such a short conversation, so many practical takeaways for our listeners here today. And I feel like we've only scratched the surface at some of the expertise and insights you could be offering, Lance. But I also think we're out of time today. So I very much want to thank you for joining us on this episode of the Principal Podcast. And again, for all of our listeners, I'm Amy Hanan with LRN. Thank you for listening in.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. The Principled Podcast is brought to you by LRN. At LRN, our mission is to inspire principled performance in global organizations by helping them foster winning, ethical cultures rooted in sustainable values. Please visit us at lrn.com to learn more. And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And don't forget to leave us a review.